Today is my conversation with lighting designer Jamie Roderick. Thank you for listening to The Backstage Creative. My name is Krista Copper. I started this podcast about 2.5 years ago because I felt that the people who work behind the scenes of theater were just underrepresented, underappreciated, and weren't given the notice and the applause and the recognition that they deserved. You know, it's easy for audiences to be amazed at actors or directors, and even to an extent, musicians like myself. But I mean, the magic that goes on in the stage management team, and the collaboration that has to happen amongst the design team, and the high level of skill that it takes to be a really good audio engineer. Those are art forms that I think are not always given the respect and admiration that they deserve. So then, yeah, here I am, 2.5 years later. I've interviewed probably around 100 guests by this point. I don't keep track of how many guests I've interviewed. I just, for me personally, I feel like I would get kind of competitive with other podcasts, or I don't know. I don't like reducing people to numbers. So yeah, that's just the kind of the decision I've made with my podcast. Everyone does it different. That's the great thing about podcasts. There's so many different ways to do it. There's so much freedom in the podcast format. And so I love trying to find what I like the best and what my listeners seem to like the best. But yeah, I've said it before and I'll say it again. I think podcasting, I think everyone should have a podcast. It's such a great way to stretch yourself a little bit and to learn new skills and to grow your network. And you learn how to speak in public better. And, the art of guiding a conversation is so valuable. I have learned and grown so much personally as a result of this. And so if you're thinking about doing a podcast or have an idea for one, I say just jump right in. I mean, there's so many tutorials on YouTube about how to use all the different equipment. There's dozens, if not hundreds, of blogs devoted to helping people get started on podcasts, and forums to ask questions. There's a huge community out there that's helping people launch podcasts, and so it's if you're thinking about doing one, I say just go for it. You really have very little to lose. Even if you fail miserably and it's a total flop, I mean, at least you tried, right? At least you had the courage to step into the ring and try something, and there's no failure in that. Like I said at the beginning, today's my conversation with Jamie Roderick, who's a lighting designer. We have a mutual friend that I've interviewed on this podcast before, Becca Pierce. Becca was my first podcast interviewee so long ago, so long ago. And one of the reasons I chose Becca, I knew that I could lean on her great ability to communicate during a time period when I was still floundering around trying to figure out how to do a podcast. And so I very intentionally chose someone like Becca, who's a really good speaker and communicator, to be the first person that I interviewed. And yeah, so if you haven't listened to the Becca Pierce episode, go back and listen to that way back at the beginning. The sound quality is a lot more different. I ignore most of what I say. Because I was learning, and I'm still learning. That's one of the great things about life, is that even if you're not the best at something, at least even if you've been working at it for 2 days, hopefully you're better than you were when you started. And it's a journey and it's a process. And I love process, and I love thinking about process and trying to make my process more efficient and more impactful. So yeah, as with everything, this podcast isn't perfect. My interview skills are not perfect, but they are a whole heck of a lot better than when I started. So again, if you're thinking of a project, a podcast, a project, whatever, the sooner you start, the sooner you can get better. So those are my thoughts for this introduction. Let's get to this interview with Jamie Roderick. Nice. So what have you been up to this last year and a half of pandemic madness?
Well, that's a great question. I'm, still in a way figuring that out every day. We had sort of an interesting journey through it. Becca and myself and some other folks that I've worked with on numerous projects over the years during the pandemic moved up to a theater that I've had a long standing relationship with for decades. And since they couldn't produce their normal summer season, their housing was sitting empty. So we moved into their open housing for this summer, lived, a huge portion of the pandemic out there while working with them in exchange for us living there. We're working with them to do a bunch of outdoor drive-in style theater. So nothing too crazy, small concerts, cabaret acts, stuff like that. But it was at least something to keep the wheels in motion, as it were. So that was 6 months of that, and then the rest of the year I've been working in tandem with some theaters that have been going under renovation. I've been called in a bunch to use my lighting design expertise to consult with them. Now is this prime moment for them to do construction. So I've been consulting with a lot of different venues on their system-wide upgrades for to be ready for when things get back going, and I've been doing a lot of laser shows too. So, but it's all fits and spurts.
hmm so when theaters are doing construction or designing their spaces, what are some of like the needs that like the lights department needs?
Well, in these days, it's changing dramatically because the technology is changing so quickly. But in these days, there's definitely a push for energy efficiency, and the lighting equipment now is also way more capable than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. So a lot of these theaters I've been working with their upgrades during this dark period, it's switching to a lot of LED stuff that is more capable and can change colors as well as more energy efficient, but sort of tailoring the needs for their budget and for the kinds of shows that they produce. Specing different things for places that do bigger musicals versus places that are more concentrated on smaller plays, and sort of fitting the bill to what's needed for any particular venue.
I think it's interesting, like as a musician, like listening, overhearing conversations about lighting designers or sound engineers like complaining like, oh, this theater has terrible speakers, or oh, this theater has a terrible crawl space, or I don't know. So I think it's interesting to think about like what different departments like need to do their job, and how sometimes those needs are like overlooked in the design of the space.
Yeah. So it's been really exciting in this period of time where my normal work isn't going on. That sort of my expertise has been able to be used to prevent those kinds of problems from happening to venues that are undergoing sort of renovations right now. So that's been a sort of a little blessing during this period to be able to put those skills to use.
Yeah, for sure. I would love to hear about your background, where you're from, where you went to school, if you went to school, and how you got into theater and lighting and all of that good stuff.
So I grew up in the theater business. My family is all that background is all in theater. My dad and stepmom were Broadway performers, and my dad became a director later in his life. My mom was an actress and theater teacher. My stepdad is a musician, primarily for musicals. So I very much grew up backstage with my family. So that is what got me deeply into the business. But finding lighting was sort of a bit of a different path than they took, and I think it really was all that time around them, seeing how a show gets put together and seeing how a lighting designer is often very much they're in the a piece of the process which is really interesting, which is where when tech happens, all of these different departments come together, and the lighting designer is sort of that is their moment to shine, as it were, when all of the pieces are getting put together, and helping the director solve problems in the space that couldn't be solved at other points in the process. And I think that is what attracted me to that role. And I've been doing lighting since I was a child. Really, I found it very young and continued with it, and ultimately ended up going to SUNY Purchase for a BFA in lighting design, a school that has had many wonderful lighting designers, among other kinds of theatrical designers, come out of it, from Brian McDevitt and Jason Lyons and Jen Schriever and many more. So I was really trying to follow in their footsteps and deciding to go there. And luckily, I'm able to call those a lot of those folks peers and mentors and friends.
Man, that is so cool to have like that, the background, like growing up backstage and being able to witness from a really young age, the magic that happens backstage. What are some of like your like earliest theater memories?
Oh, that's oh man, it's so hard to say because it was just such an integral part of every moment. But I think there's a few that stand out, or there's moments that I think a lot of people look at, that I know certainly were probably those moments that shaped me when I was very young. One of which is when my father was in A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum on Broadway. There was this kid backstage all the time, and that was me. And they didn't kind of always know what to do with them. So I spent a lot of time sitting with Artie Gaffin, the stage manager, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. Maybe it isn't even a couple of years now. Wasn't too long ago, and I would listen to him call a Broadway show multiple times a week. And I think that kind of experience at a very young age is really memorable to me and really strongly shaped me. There are other experiences from around that time. Maybe I was slightly older, but when the Alan Menken Lynn Ahrens version of A Christmas Carol would be put up at Madison Square Garden, I was in the room often for that and watching sort of masters of the craft at work. Susan Stroman and Jules and Peggy. That was one of their shows, and so there. I have so many memories of being there, and again, these really experts in their craft, getting to watch them work at that age, and the memories I still have of it, and that have certainly come to shape the kind of designer I am today. And then also not Broadway, being at other theaters around the country with my mom and stepdad, and smaller theaters, and seeing how that production process happens in a more intimate way. Watching Chris Dallas, a great lighting designer, work, that I was able to work alongside at a very young age, and have wonderful memories of him from when I was a child. Still consider him a friend to this day. Another amazing person that has come to help shape the way I work.
Did you ever go through periods of, oh, maybe want to be a stage manager or an actor, or was it always like, was lights always your thing?
Yeah, never. I This was like very much my focus from a very young age, which is one of the wildest things about going through this pandemic, is that I have also been, because I've never been that person that has ever wavered or ever really had interest in doing anything else, and then being forced to stop. And being a lighting designer is part of what has defined me, and having to put that on hold in a lot of ways, and focus on other things, often um, non-willingly, for a period of time, was an interesting experiment to go through. And how does one define oneself? And on the other side of it, I think what I found for me is that passion is still unwavering. I still want to come out of this, and continue my craft, and still define myself by my work, which is maybe not the healthiest thing, but I don't know another way of doing it.
hmm yeah, I love that. Yeah, I think a lot of us have had to ask ourselves like, who am I away from this? Who am I when I'm not pursuing this, and when I've kind of not let go of it, but just maybe laid it to the side a little bit. And that's a hard process to go through.
Yeah. Yep.
I would love to hear about your process. I ask like every designer who I interview about their process because I think it's fascinating because that's not something that I do, and so I'm just really curious about it. So someone calls you up, asks you to design lights for the show. What's the next? How do you get to Tech Week?
I know for me personally, I don't feel that I have a extraordinarily strict version of my process. I certainly know people that do and respect people that do. And I find that my process changes drastically based on the kind of production it is and the kinds of collaborators I am working with on a show. And it also changes drastically based on when in the creative process I am brought into a show. There are shows I have been involved with since there was even a first draft, which a show like that, I'm going to be more deeply involved in the creative process and talking to the writers and talking to the director about very, very vague, broad stroke ideas of what a design palette for a show could even look like. Or if we took the show creatively in a different direction, storytelling wise, what visually could that look like? And I've had the luxury to, on many shows, be able to be involved that early on. Versus other shows where, say, being brought in later, or there's already sort of a scenic designer in place, and there I am. My role might be a little different, and there's a strong creative direction they're already heading in, and then my role becomes, okay, how can I best support that creative um, direction and getting ideas to how best to facilitate and make come to life these directors' ideas or other design departments' ideas. And then in terms of either way, making that happen, sometimes it's as simple as just, oh, there's a clear vision for this show, and I need to sit down and just simply put a light plot together and light the show. And others, it's very different. Maybe I'm doing tons of research on images of certain landscapes or certain types of architecture and how the light falls in that architecture, and then doing studies on how best to recreate that. Other times, maybe it's not realistic, but I'm doing sketches of how to what I want the light to convey in terms of pattern and color, and sketches that are certainly not what an artist would look like, but I can show to a director to say, hey, this is what I'm thinking of. Is this in the same path that you're thinking? And using that as a tool. And other times, getting into a computer and almost lighting it virtually in a computer before we ever walk into a theater. So my process personally changes drastically based on the needs of the production and who I'm working with. I hope that answers the question.
I mean, it makes sense, especially as a lighting designer. Like from my understanding, a lot of times you're kind of the last designer piece of the brought in. So yeah, it makes sense to have more of a fluid process as opposed to maybe like a set designer who's usually kind of more early on in the process.
Yes, yeah, and I think that is certainly the most typical scenario, which is why I just try to stay that fluid, because for my own career, yes, that is the typical thing, and yes, that is the typical thing for most productions. But then I also have these experiences with wonderful collaborators that I love working with, where I'm often the first person in the room. So I had that role changes, and just staying open to, okay, what can I bring to this process? What are these writers? What are these directors looking for out of me? And it's been quite a luxury often to be able to be in the room sometimes that early.
As I've interviewed other lighting designers, I pick up like hints of frustration when when they talk about their process and kind of how late sometimes they're brought in. So I'm sure that it is really nice to be in on those meetings pretty early on.
Yeah.
I really like big questions.
Sure.
So take this any way that you want to go. But like, what are some questions that you like to ask during like maybe the first design meeting, or during like the very beginning stages of the process? What are some of the questions that, or do you have any questions that you typically like to ask?
Yeah, I think I like to understand the emotions of a character and characters. So I will ask, especially in doing plays, I will ask, what is this character feeling, and how do you want the audience to think they're feeling? And because I have found that lighting is an unbelievably powerful tool for an audience's subconscious, and I can manipulate the audience in terms of feeling a way about a character, as well as understanding how a character is feeling, sometimes with an enormity of power, and sometimes I've even made mistakes and conveyed the wrong thing. So I've tried to ask those questions to writers and directors early in the process, because sometimes it's not clear on the page how a director is going to direct a moment, or and what an actor is going to find in a rehearsal process to convey in the moment. So having those kinds of conversations, where I really understand the intention of the direction, the intention of the actor, what they're trying to feel, because I can then help support it, or at the very least, if lighting is not the tool at the time to help support those emotions, I at least won't counter it, make a mistake and somehow counter it. So being very open with everyone in the room about those sort of emotional conversations around character, I find are often not talked about and are crucial to talk
Is that something that's kind of intuitive, in terms of like lighting influencing how people are feeling? Is that something that comes intuitive to you, or is it something that's developed? Like, how do you know like what's gonna be effective?
I think that there's certainly a lot of intuition there, but it's two things. It's color, and then it's shape. If depending on what color is used on somebody, if I'm brightening them or making them feel warm and making someone feel welcoming, versus using colors that maybe cast them in a colder light. An audience is going to feel one way about the character, as well as the shape of the light, how it strikes somebody. If their face is filled with shadow, or if their face is illuminated in a flat, lovely way, where you can see all of the details in their features. Those two things are going to dramatically shape how an audience feels about somebody. So yeah, trying to focus on that is always a strong point.
Hmm. What's your measurement for effectiveness in your design?
I think that would depend on the kind of show. I think the number one thing for me is if the story gets told. If people leave the theater understanding the story that we wanted them to leave understanding, and if we want them to leave with asking questions, then they're leaving asking questions. I think, and that is the key, I think, to the success of any production, and that is where all departments coming together so that our individual crafts are in alignment for the success of that specific thing, making sure the story is understood. I think, to me, would be the key to knowing something was successful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. That's like the essence of what we do and why we're in theater in the first place is the stories. When you think about a great collaborative team, um, what are some of the characteristics of like the best teams that you've been on?
For me, ones where this is hard to say because I think there'd be people that disagree with me strongly. But I know for me, I love when I'm in the room with a director that I know really, really well, both personally and professionally. And it's to the point where we almost don't even have to discuss a note, where he or she can look at me and I know instinctively what they are thinking, and be fixing the notes before it's even said vocally. I love when I'm in the room and I have that kind of a relationship with my collaborators. And I use directors as an example specifically because there's a couple I can already think of that I love working with, and we have that kind of rapport. But it's certainly not limited to just directors. It's your other design collaborator, the other designers on the show, and I know, there's lovely video designers and costume designers, and that I have that kind of rapport with. It's a little different with scenic designers and costumes to a degree because we're not make often their work is done, and there's some notes that need to happen on their end during tech, but they're not in tech. It's not as specific in making a moment as you say would with a sound designer, a video designer, or a director. But I love when we're all making a moment together, and there's almost the lack of dialogue because we know each other so well and know each other's tastes so well. And I know there's a lot of people that would disagree with me on that too. That like that more talking, even if you have that kind of relationship, is good. But I just love when we find those moments together.
Mm-hmm. Maybe this is a question that can't be answered. I don't know, but like how long does it take to build that type of rapport with someone?
Years. I mean,
Yeah.
truly years. Shows really need to get workshopped. And I think a lot of energy is put into workshopping scripts and doing readings of scripts and doing, maybe a movement workshop for the development of a new show. And but I also need a turn at that. Not always, but if it's a show that's really in development and really trying to find its voice, um, having that show go through incremental stages of development of production, from a small production and growing it to a large production, I know I value so strongly the shows that I've had those opportunities to take from a smaller production to a larger production, because we've learned the vocabulary of the show together, and we've also learned how to work together, and what we're going to be able to create is going to be so much stronger than just throwing everything at it with one chance, because we're still learning the show and we're still learning how to communicate in the room, and having the luxury of developing a show over years with people is what I think brings out that kind of relationship that to answer your question, and but also then is a key to the success of many shows going through a development process.
So do you think that type of rapport comes from mostly time spent with people, or do you think it's comes from just personalities meshing? Does that make sense?
I think all the above. I really think all the above. It is time spent and finding out how a director works and finding out how another designer works. But it is also personalities and understanding if I am the aesthetic choice for a certain show, if I am the but then if I am also the personality choice for a certain show, if my contribution in that room, if the energy I bring to the room itself is the right energy for that kind of production. And I'd say I'm sort of a pretty like energetic individual in tech. So if somebody doesn't, if that's not somebody's vibe, maybe I'm not the right choice for that particular production. So I think it really is all of the above.
Mm-hmm. As you're talking, I was thinking about like musicians that I've played with that I've really just clicked with. And yeah, it is. Yeah, it's both personality and time spent because there's been people that I've played with a lot that um, we still kind of struggle, but it's like a personality thing. So yeah, it's kind of that magic combination.
Yeah, and I also think there's ways around it. If say me and a specific personality are maybe not the best collaborators personality wise, I just need to turn a different side of my brain on and go, okay, now instead of 80% of my brain going to the lighting and 20% going to the room, I need to make it 50-50 and really put more energy into reading this room, because then I will understand exactly what everyone is going for, and thus the 50% of my brain going to the lighting is going to be that much stronger. So it's also knowing, as much as it's great to curate that environment, it's also understanding the environment you are in, and how to work within it.
Yeah, that's huge, especially in theater because we're always on the time constraint. There's usually stressful situations. Um, yeah, things are happening fast. There's a lot of people, and so yeah, being able to read the room, that's such a kind of an overlooked skill. Well, maybe not overlooked, but maybe a skill that's not often talked about in our industry is the ability to be able to be sensitive to the needs of a room. So during Tech Week, do you like that the pressure of everyone's kind of waiting on you? Does that ever get stressful to you?
Oh, it's
Yeah.
horrible. It's horrible. Um, it's great. It's exhilarating. Time flies in a way that I can't even describe. It is very stressful. I mean, it's great when you end up on a show and let's say there's a ton of automation or a ton of video, and it's just like, oh, normally the room is waiting on me, and I get these moments of relaxation that are like, oh, for once automation, they got to reset. I have a moment to breathe, or video has to do their notes. I have a moment to breathe or not be working at 100% all the time. So yeah, it is very, very stressful. It's exhilarating, certainly, but it is very, very stressful.
Do you have any kind of like mental tricks or like any like how do you handle that stress?
Not well. I think the number one thing there is being reliant on your team. Very few shows I do, I'm going in alone at this point. I have a wonderful, wonderful team of programmers I use and assistants I use, and there's people at the core of that. The core ones I usually use, and then other people that I love to get to use when I can, and being reliant on them, and they are as important as I am in any process, is a huge part of relieving that pressure, because you are a team doing it. No one is in it alone.
Mhm. Mhm. That's very true about every aspect of theater. I like that you mentioned the team that you work with. What makes someone like an assistant or technician someone that you want to keep working with?
Someone I can sit with for 16 hours a day. I mean, that's the gig. That's the gig, and I've been very lucky to have those people throughout my career that, my assistants, my programmers, these are some of my best friends, and we wouldn't be able to get through these kinds of processes if that weren't the case. Because we're all in it together and we're making art together, which is a very emotional thing to me, and I think to most of my collaborators, and and it's very long hours. So to be able to have that kind of personal relationship with my team is really what's allowed, what I look for, and I've been very lucky to have that.
Mm-hmm. When there is conflict, either amongst the lighting team, or you can tell maybe there's some tension in the design team or with the director, um, how do you navigate kind of like conflict and disagreement?
You have to sometimes be able to kill your babies, as this expression goes. I mean, I think that's often where much of the conflict I see happens, is when somebody is overly committed to a certain idea, or maybe a ton of money was spent on a certain idea, or maybe a ton of time was put into a specific idea. And ultimately, if it's not serving the greater goal of getting the story told, it's got to go. And it's got to go sort of peacefully. That conflict arising from having to let go of something, I think, is one of the more toxic things that we've all, myself included, have been guilty of in this business. And it's certainly a learning curve to know how to let go of those things, but that is one of the things I think that is most important for overcoming conflict.
Yeah, that makes sense. How do you choose your battles? How do you decide like when to let something go and when to kind of stand your ground?
If it comes from a specific experiences, um, and understanding who has the experience with what the issue is at hand. I'm thinking of a specific example where I was working with some television folks, and they came to the table with their needs, because television is certainly a very different animal than theater, and I'm collaborating with them, and their goals were very different than mine, and but I understood that the core of a particular show was how the color changed through the show, and making sure that was captured on camera was a battle I picked, because I understood that the arc of that is part of the arc of this piece of storytelling. A TV personality might not be seeing it that same way, but in terms of other battles on that same production, there's things that they were able to bring to the table that I didn't know. That, I'm gonna not fight this battle because you know way more about how to make something look good on camera than I do, and I'm pretty good at it. But so basically giving up on everything else, but making sure that that one note about color, what I fought for, because I knew the piece. They knew how to shoot for camera, but I knew the show. So understanding who's coming to the table with what goals in mind and what experience, and why they're picking the battle they're picking, I think is the great way to understand when it's worth fighting, or when somebody in the room might know more than you about a specific something for a specific reason.
When you think of like your favorite projects to work on, what have been your favorite stories to tell, or what are your favorite types of projects that just get you really excited to get to work?
Anything new, anything being written new. I love being part of that creative process, developing a new show. I mean, there's just nothing like it. We all love the classics and love doing classics, but I love working on fresh pieces, and being part of the process of making a show come to life and solving problems on a page that need to be solved in the process of actually building a show from scratch. I love that more than anything. I also really love working outside. I think working outside, doing theater outside, brings unique challenges that I love problem solving through, especially if it's being done in unique environments, where the rigidity of the physical walls of a theater are not a constraint, and there's no constraints because you're building a theater from the ground up outdoors. I love the freshness of that and that excitement. So I'd say those two things, new works and working outdoors.
This may be like a weird question. How does a lighting designer help with like a new work? You know, I can picture how like a set designer or costume or, but what does that look like for a lighting designer to kind of be in on the ground floor of a new work?
So I think what a lighting designer gets to offer very strongly on any show that other designers don't have necessarily as strong of a role in is how a show moves from point A to point B. How we get from scene to scene, how we get from moment to moment, how we get from beat to beat, if you want to break it down to that granular level. To be able to be in on the ground floor of a new work and be able to help craft the flow of the show, being involved. I have lots of conversations with sound designers about, I need a bit of sound here to justify a light change so that I can focus in on this intimate moment, or talking to a composer and say, hey, can some underscoring come in here? Because if some underscoring comes in, I can start bringing this moment down very small to them, and that way we hide a person entering from upright, because I was able to focus down left because you added that underscoring that justified that light cue. It's stuff to that level that I love being in the room for, where I can ask other departments for those kinds of things, because then it can make my work justify the lighting to do something that is then helping better serve the storytelling and the movement of a show as a whole.
I've never thought of that, but that makes a lot of sense. What are some of the challenges of working on new works?
Knowing if it's good or not. There's a lot of pressure, and this is why I encourage as many shows as I do to go through a real workshop process and a real out-of-town tryout process, and instead of just putting it all your eggs in one basket one time, because there is a added layer of stress I think everyone is under, not knowing until that first preview how an audience is going to respond. And that is a really, really stressful time that I think is the biggest challenge, and constantly questioning, is what I'm doing here right? Because you're not going to know until you get to that first preview. So I think that is the biggest challenge with new works.
Have there been works that you've worked on that you thought, oh, this is amazing, it's gonna just everyone's gonna love it, and then it's kind of flopped, and vice versa?
100% on both accounts. I'm not going to tell you which shows, but
Sure.
I've been on both sides of that equation. Shows that myself and some of my collaborators went into going, this show is going to run for 3 weeks and get hammered by the press. Let's take some real design risks, because no one is going to, there's no risk here. And then sure enough, those design risks we took, because it felt like there were no stakes, ended up paying off in spades. And then that show was hugely successful, maybe because of those design risks we took, or just the show itself, a combination of both. I mean, I have absolutely had that happen. And then there's been shows I've been involved with that I thought, this is going to be a home run. This is the most obvious home run there's ever been, and that have flopped horribly. So you just don't know. which is again why I'm like, oh, you workshop, get it in front of small audiences, get it from the small audiences, and learn those lessons before the stakes are too high. And then if you see that something isn't working, correct it before you move up to a level where there are real stakes.
When something like that happens, does that make you doubt like your creativity or your, like your intuition?
I don't think it is as much about doubting intuition as much as it is about don't underestimate the audience themselves. And different audiences are going to be attracted to different shows. It's as much about as much about marketing as it is about the creative process. And a show finding its voice to the right audience and who those ticket buyers are, because ultimately at the end of the day, it is a business. And maybe the thing that I thought was going to be a home run, well, they can't. They're catering to a crowd that doesn't have the ticket buying capacity as another kind of audience. And a show that I thought was going to be a flop, well, it's speaking directly to an audience that I didn't even realize existed, and here they are, seeing a production 3 times because it's speaking directly to them. I don't think those experiences make me doubt my creativity because I'm going to put my best into it no matter what. But it makes me always remember to never underestimate who your audience is and who might be out there.
That's really interesting to think about, like thinking about like how shows are marketed has such a big impact on how successful they are.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like to ask everyone the same final question. And it used to be advice to young people, but I've decided to change it just to do something different. My new final question is what are you excited about right now?
I am excited about getting back to work in hopefully a slightly saner way. I am very much the person that is guilty of jumping tech to tech to tech process, 16-hour days every day. In the past, not being able to put in the level of pre production to every project of mine that I would like to be able to put in. So, as work does begin to start back up again, I'm really excited for pre production processes and being able to give it my all in a moment of time that I often on many productions have not been able to give it my all in. So I'm very excited about that. I'm very excited about some projects on the horizon. I'm very excited about our community as a whole getting back to work, and I'm very excited about witnessing the changes happening in theater that probably should have happened a very long time ago, and it seems that those things are occurring, and we're all getting to witness history. So I'm excited for all of it.
The music for the Backstage Creative was improvised and performed by Ian Leroy, and the logo was designed by Carly Wagner.